Okay. Hi everyone, my name is Sam Hanson. Thank you guys so much for coming today. This is probably one of the most important topics we should be discussing right now. A lot of friends here, thanks for coming. A lot of new faces as well. So, hopefully by the end of this presentation I'll be able to open you guys up if you're not already aware of a lot of the material of the stuff we're talking about today. But it's such an important issue beyond the idea of disproving mainstream consensus. If we really want to have any political change or any significant political direction, we need to tear down the lies first. And so the 9/11 is the basis of the War of Terror. The War of Terror is one of the biggest threats to humanity that we currently face due to state authoritarianism over the individual. So we're here today to dispel the myth of 9/11. I'm going to say it very plainly, 9/11 was an inside job. It was a controlled demolition of the towers used to justify passing the Patriot Act and launching wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. As we go through this presentation today, you'll find out my reasons for that. The idea of the deep state, false flags, and the war on terrorism, they're all one system, it's all interlinked. The deep state has only really become popular as a term in the last couple of years, but if we want to maintain an intellectual discourse that actually tackles the real issues, we need to start learning who the real actors in society are. So, no further ado, let's begin. False flags are an inconvenient truth. We can deny them as much as we want. We can live in terror, live in apathy. We can bury our heads in the sand. But if we don't come to terms with the reality that government-sponsored state terrorism is a reality, then there's never going to be any change. In fact, it's going to be change for the worse. A false flag. The idea of a false flag, a horrific staged event blamed on a political enemy and used as a pretext to start a war or enact draconian laws in the name of national security. In the sense, you don't even have to, oftentimes you can hijack your own events or you can orchestrate them, either way. Problem, reaction, solution is the formula for false flag operations. So you start off with a traumatic event, and if one is not available to you, you manufacture it. You use your state operatives and you can manufacture your own event. Once the event occurs, you then control the reaction. So you manufacture the emotion required to generate the direction you're heading forward. And the most important thing about generating emotion is you need an enemy. And so a big part of false flag is it was actually based on the old pirate term of using other ships' flags and actually boarding them under false pretenses. But in the terms of the modern deep state operations, it's just about claiming a false identity. And then the idea is once you've created the event, controlled the reaction, then you can present your solution to the crisis. And this is what this is all about. It's people in power after certain agendas or certain directions, and using the problem, reaction, solution formula to achieve those. All right, so let's go through a history of false flags. And this is just a very brief, absolutely, there's hundreds of thousands throughout history, from massive to minor. But a great fire of Rome in AD 64, Emperor Nero, it's alleged, he actually burnt down half of Rome, and he blamed it on the Christians. And Emperor Nero then had one of the most brutal tyrannies in Roman history, one of them. The sinking, modern times, the sinking of the Lusitania in 1913. This is what got the Americans into World War I. Right? Back then, American public policy was, we cannot engage in a war outside of American borders. It's not America's problem. It was actually in their constitution that they wouldn't engage outside of American soil. But they needed the trigger to get into the war, because there was many people who wanted to get into the war, and we'll talk about the military-industrial complex later on in the lecture. the German embassy was issuing warnings: do not board the Lusitania, do not. You were going through an active war zone. But it was actually censored in a lot of the media at the time. I can't remember which newspaper this one was in, but it was one of the few to actually get the post. The Reichstag fire, 1933. Hitler had just gained a majority in the German parliament, and they had the idea that they wanted dictatorial powers. They wanted authoritarian powers. So what they do, they burn down the Reichstag and they blame it on a communist. And as it's burning in the fanfare afterwards, they pass what's called the enabling laws. These laws granted Hitler the absolute dictatorship over all of Germany, and is what led to the absolute dictatorship of the Nazi Party. We know this one's true because in the Nuremberg trials afterwards, multiple SS officers confessed during the Nuremberg trials. The Gulf of Tonkin. This was how America got into the Vietnam War. And in hindsight, we can say it's hilarious. Is a very morbid word, but the Gulf of Tonkin never happened. It was all a media facade. But what they alleged happened was that the Vietnamese started. I think the Vietnamese submarines were attacking American ships, but in reality, nothing happened except the media coverage that covered it. But it was enough. It was an excuse to get the U.S. into the Vietnam War, the triggering into the full-scale invasion. Operation Gladio. After World War II, Europe was divided between the capitalist West and the Cold War East, and the communist East. And in a massive fear of communist invasion and infiltration, the Western intelligence agencies, CIA, MI6, and NATO, and Mossad, I think as well, they were operating false flag terrorist operations under the guise of blaming them on communists to stop the spread of communism throughout Europe. And this is Operation Gladio. You can check all sorts of stuff on that one. Operation Northwoods. This was during the Kennedy era, and it only recently became disclosed. Some of the general chiefs of staff wanted to get rid of Fidel Castro in Cuba. So what they did was they formulated this plan that, okay, we're going to attack American civilians. We're going to bomb American public places. We're going to down commercial airplanes, attacks on our own military and U.S. naval ship, all sorts of stuff, and blame it to justify an invasion on Cuba. But Kennedy got wind of these plans and he cancelled it right out. So that's why I'm a massive fan of JFK. So that's just a small tidbit of the false flags. I could go on for hours on that, but we've got much more important stuff to cover. What is new in our human history since World War II is the first time that humans have had a physical, powerful military-industrial complex. And this is an important warning I want to show you guys. This is from President Eisenhower after his.
Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States.
Good evening, my fellow Americans. We now stand 10 years past the midpoint of a century that has witnessed 4 major wars among great nations. Until the latest of our world conflicts, the United States had no armaments industry. American makers of plowshares could, with time and as required, make swords as well. But we can no longer risk emergency improvisation of national defense. We have been compelled to create a permanent armaments industry of vast proportions. Added to this, 3.5 million men and women are directly engaged in the defense establishment. Now, this conjunction of an immense military establishment and a large arms industry is new in the American experience. The total influence, economic, political, even spiritual, is felt in every city, every state house, every office of the federal government. We recognize the imperative need for this development. yet we must not fail to comprehend its grave implications. Our toil, resources, and livelihood are all involved. So is the very structure of our society. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes. We should take nothing for granted. Only an alert and knowledgeable citizenry can compel the proper meshing of the huge industrial and military machinery of defense with our peaceful methods and goals, so that security and liberty may prosper together.
Now, he was warning us of the new system that had grown out of the World War II. Unfortunately, we haven't listened in the slightest, and the military-industrial complex is bigger than ever. War is a racket. It is possibly the oldest, easiest, easily the most profitable, surely the most vicious. It is the only one international in scope. It is the only one in which the profits are reckoned in dollars and the losses in lives. It is conducted for the benefit of the many, of the very few, at the expense of the very many. Out of war, a few people make huge fortunes. This is General Smedley D. Butler of the US. He wrote a book called War is a Racket. It's an absolute must-read. He was actually one of the greatest defenders of liberty. In the US, forces actually tried to recruit him for an absolute fascist coup d'etat of the United States back in the 30s, but he blew the whistle, and that's why we don't have a fascist dictatorship in America today, because of this guy, Smedley Butler. These are some of the most powerful companies in the US military-industrial complex today. You've got Lockheed Martin, General Dynamics, Booz Allen Hamilton, Raytheon, Northrop Grumman, and Boeing. Lockheed Martin is the one, I think they're the ones doing the FA fighter jets for Australia, and that's an absolute billion-dollar contract, and the jets they're absolute dog shit. They get smashed by the Russian stuff anyway, so why are we still paying for them? Okay, so now let's talk about the deep state. Kevin Shipp divided the shadow government and the deep state into two separate entities, and I like that definition as well. The shadow government is the government that rules behind the scenes. It's the idea that no matter who you vote for, no matter what parliamentarians get in, the shadow government are the people who are really running the country. The shadow government controls the country through the deep state, and the deep state is a broad term to describe the intelligence and police agencies, the military-industrial complex, intelligence contractors, defense contractors, central banks, the Wall Street, City of London, and investment funds, and then the IMF and the World Bank. So it combines finance, and military, and force into one combined system. Okay, so now I get on to the most important part of this presentation. 9/11 was 9/11 an inside job? I'm here today telling you that I believe 9/11 was an inside job. I believe it was a controlled demolition, and I believe they had multiple reasons for engaging in false flag terrorism, which I'll get onto later. But the most important thing today is that we'll go through and we'll understand why the official story doesn't even make sense, and how it's physically impossible for us to, for the official story to stick to the available evidence. Okay, so the official story. On September 11th, 19 men hijacked 4 US commercial airplanes. These men were organized by Osama bin Laden operating for Al-Qaeda. At 8:46, American Airlines Flight 11 crashes into the...
Right then and there,
Alright, that was at 8:46 a.m. At 9:03 a.m., United Airlines Flight 175 crashes into the World Trade Center South Tower. So this is the second plane that crashes into the towers. At 9:37, Flight 77 crashes into the Pentagon. This is according to the official story. So Flight 77 crashes into the Pentagon. At 9:59, The south tower of the World Trade Center collapses. So this is the second tower to get hit by a plane. Collapses.
Fire. I don't even know how much fire equipment they've been able to move up onto those upper floors.
It's just coming down, Pat. It is just coming down.
Watch the right
It's
side.
exploding.
The building is ripping apart.
It is billowing. Pat, the debris is flying. I'm going to run.
Okay. Good.
Holy shit! Holy shit! That was fucking crazy! Oh shit!
Different view. Both buildings are aflame. And then the building that was hit second comes tumbling down. That was the one where the airplane came in particularly quickly and hit the building at about floor 71.
Okay, I'm at 10:07 a.m. Flight 93 crashes into a field in Somerset County, Pennsylvania. The official story is that the passengers overtook the hijackers, and then the hijackers crashed it down into the field. 10:28, the second tower collapses. The north tower of the World Trade Center.
When it went down, I could see like it was paddling.
Yeah, sort of.
Like,
So this way.
it's one piece still not going down. Steel, look at the steel.
Oh my God.
After that, the second tower just collapsing into a pile of rubble.
Here's the AP lead out of New York. In a horrific sequence of destruction, terrorists crashed two planes into the World Trade Center, and the twin 110-story towers collapsed this morning.
World Trade Center 7. One of the big mysteries around 9/11 is that people don't actually realize that there were actually 3 towers that fell that day. Even Americans, only 50% of them understand that the 3 towers actually collapsed on 9/11. This is called the World Trade Center 7, or I think it's the Solomon Brothers building, and it's right next door to the 9/11. Oh, to the World Trade Center 1 and 2. That's World Trade Center 7. At 5:20 p.m. and no plane hit World Trade Center 7. It had been on fire for the last couple hours, and at 5:20 p.m. this is what occurs. Okay, so that's the official story. Now, I'm here today to telling you my reasons why I think 9/11 was an inside job. First of all, there is ample evidence that there was a controlled demolition. and I'll get into what a controlled demolition is up next. The most important thing that relates it back to the American intelligence system is it was the internal failure of the US air defense system. So the idea of the interceptor planes and NORAD, the North American Aerospace Defense System, I think that's what it's called. The 9/11 Commission itself is a blatant cover-up designed to hide and discredit evidence. And Osama bin Laden is a patsy, just like Lee Harvey Oswald, to set up to suit an agenda. And it fulfills the false flag problem, reaction, solution, which I was talking about earlier, which we'll get into after when we talk about the why 9/11 occurred. Okay, so let's talk about controlled demolition. When we saw that footage before, the speed at which the towers fell shows that they faced almost zero physical resistance from the building structure below themselves. They were falling literally like constant pancakes. The towers themselves pulverized into dust and rubble. It collapsed in on itself without the delay of a pancaking effect. This bottom one, if you dropped a cue ball from the top of the towers, it would take you 12 seconds for that cue ball to get from the top of the tower down to the floor. The towers collapsed in 15, 12, just almost at the speed of free fall. As for the pancaking effect, one of the official arguments they use is that I'll get into it up next, but as the buildings were collapsing, as you had the floors and the steel beams, the floors were collapsing on top of each other, getting bigger and bigger and bigger. But what happens, you would have seen a pancake effect if that happened. As the footage shows, it's an absolute clear freefall. Molten steel, this is an important one. The official narrative claims that the reason the towers collapsed was that the fire from the jet fuel of the planes was hot enough to melt the steel beams to cause a complete structural collapse of the towers. There is evidence of molten steel and metal throughout the World Trade Center wreckage. This is, you've all heard it before, but it's absolutely scientific fact. Jet fuel does not burn at a temperature hot enough to melt steel beams. So we'll get into more of this now.
You'd get down below and you'd see molten steel running down the channel rails. Like you're in a foundry.
Yeah, like lava.
Like it was lava
from a volcano.
Actually melted beams where it was molten steel that was being dug out.
Underground, it was still so hot that molten metal dripped down the sides of a wall.
It's this fused element of steel, molten steel and concrete and all of these things all fused by the heat into one single element.
And they pulled off a big block of concrete, and there was like a little river of steel flowing.
Many witnesses, firemen and lots of people described the flowing molten metal, iron or steel at extremely hot temperatures, and John Gross categorically denied their observations, so that because their observations don't fit his preconceived notion, he not only ignored evidence, he denied evidence.
There were reports of molten steel having been seen in the rubble pile of all three buildings, and I knew that jet fuel, which is essentially kerosene, is not capable of melting steel nor iron. Kerosene or jet fuel burns at less than 1600 degrees Fahrenheit, and molten steel needs at least 2700 degrees Fahrenheit in order to melt.
In an office fire, you cannot generate enough heat to melt steel. And yet we have evidence of molten iron in the microspheres, in the rubble pile, and the metal pouring out of the side of the tower.
There was molten metal pouring out the side of the towers as it was occurring. So how do you explain this? Yeah? To me, it can only mean one thing. It was a controlled demolition. And you now have an abundance of evidence of nanothermite. Nanothermite is a explosive material used for literally used in controlled demolitions and military explosives. This is a peer-reviewed physics journal saying active thermite material discovered in dust from the 9/11 World Trade Center catastrophe, and multiple particles in dust samples were found to contain thermite. And these are from independent dust and rubble samples, because what happened after the towers came down, the Bush administration came in and they locked down the towers, and they wouldn't let anyone retrieve any material from the towers to do any independent testings or anything like that. So it was these are from independent samples taken, and there was also nanothermite ash found on the windshields of cars ages away from the blast. So my theory, it's an absolutely global theory of the controlled demolition. Controlled demolitions are a common practice throughout the construction industry. The use of high-grade explosives placed on key support beams can collapse a building. Nanothermite is often used in controlled demolitions and can easily reach temperatures of 4,500 degrees Fahrenheit plus. Okay, this is a sample of a controlled demolition. This is an actual controlled demolition. They're using explosives all throughout the towers, and let's see how quickly this goes down.
Unbelievable. Whoa.
On the top of that 12-story building, there's...
More evidence of a controlled demolition. You have these beams all across the base of the World Trade Center, cut at angles, directly cut. According to the official story, the fire was melted it and caused it to bend. Well, not according to the footage of the actual evidence down on the bottom floor. This is a direct cut. I've got some more photos. Here we go. Here's some more. It's direct cuts. And also on these beams, there's multiple peer journals finding nanothermite on the beams themselves, along with the dust and the debris. So a clear case in my book for a controlled demolition. But let's go one step further. Let's compare it to some other stuff. So World Trade Center 7, I was talking about it before. The majority of people don't even know World Trade Center 7 exists, but it was never hit by a plane. And the official story was that the fire from the other towers spread across and caused the World Trade Center 7 to structurally fail. Well, we'll see how just garbage that argument is in a second. Okay. The National Institute of Standards and Technology, which is basically a government unit, released a report on the collapse of World Trade Center 7. Actually, it's not a government unit anyway. To me, this is an absolute cover-up for sure. They claim that the fire structurally was sufficient to weaken the structure to enable its collapse. When engineers and architects asked to review the computer models, the NIST refused to give away the modeling they used because it would jeopardize public safety, or probably it would just throw their argument right out the window and we'll realize what a farcical it is. This is a hotel fire. This was in Madrid, 2005. This hotel was on fire for, I think it was 3 days it burnt. And yet, look, the steel framing is still there. That's because the normal combustible material inside a building does not heat high enough to cut through steel. And so that's where the controlled demolition argument really gains its steam. And so now let's compare World Trade Center 7 with some direct controlled demolitions. So on the right you'll have a controlled demolition, on the left you'll have World Trade Center 7. to me, it's farcical that anyone can believe the mainstream media, the mainstream official story after this. Okay, so that was my presentation on the controlled demolition side of the towers. But you could be saying, okay, Sam, well, it's not an inside job. Maybe Al-Qaeda got in there and planted the controlled demolitions. Good argument. But now I'm going to present you the side of where the US intelligence state gets involved in the failure that was 9/11. Okay, so NOORAD is the North American Aerospace Defense Command. This is basically they're responsible for the safety and security of America and Canada's airspace. Any time there's a plane or a rocket in basically the world, they claim they know what's going on about. They got these massive. This is in Cheyenne Mountain down. I think it's in Colorado. I think it's an absolute massive military base, and they can literally have technology that goes all over the globe. Their main purpose is maintaining security of the skies, but as we can see, they faced a colossal failure on September 11th. So what happened? Normally when there's a hijacking that takes place, NORAD will know about it within 5 minutes, and they can determine, and they'll dispatch fighter jets to intercept, and standard procedure is to shoot it down if it's going in a hostile directory. But what happened on 9/11? 4 different planes were able to take off and then veer around without getting intercepted for over an hour. This is where the complicity of the I'll get onto that later. So the planes were unmolested by interceptors, and the NORAD defense system failed that day. Why did it fail? Well, on the exact same day as 9/11, coincidentally, NORAD was running war games training simulations and then their war game scenario was multiple hijacked commercial aircraft. And so when the operators who were actually looking at the flight 11, flight 75, the actual 9/11 flights, the operators wanting the airspace were confused and saying, "Is this part of the war games? We don't know what's going on." And it's exact same time that was happening, 9/11 occurs. Well, yeah. So to me, it's a complicity, because we are told that Osama bin Laden orchestrated 9/11 with a satellite phone and a computer from a cave in Afghanistan. Well, how was Osama bin Laden able to schedule war games on September 11th? That to me just shows there was inside complicity for sure. All right, so we go into the Pentagon. The Pentagon. Okay, so the official story behind the Pentagon is that a plane crashed into the building. But what we see in the wreckage is that there is absolutely zero wreckage of any aircraft material at all, right? So the evidence says one thing and the story says another thing. Now, if you look at the size of the plane as well, if it was to make that type of directory, it would have to do an absolute massively arcing loop, which a majority of pilots couldn't actually properly do that. And the hijacker himself had actually received flight training a couple of months previously, and the flight instructor said, "Oh yeah, this guy, he couldn't even fly a single plane Cessna. So it's absolutely impossible that he could fly a Boeing 747 in a continuous arc and land it perfectly into the Pentagon." No, yeah, right. There is absolutely zero footage, very little footage available of the plane hitting the Pentagon. The Pentagon refuses to release any other security camera footage, but they're so generous, they gave us this absolutely tell-all piece of footage. Now this is the footage coming from the Pentagon, one of the most highly surveilled, high surveillance systems in the world, this is all they can give us. Yeah, right. It's an absolute farce. There was also surveillance cameras at businesses and petrol stations across the road and things like that. FBI agents came in and took the recordings away. They came in and physically took the camera footage. So they didn't want anyone seeing anything that was going on. After the crash, you have people collecting material from the wreckage, and they were literally, it was an actual cover-up, because what they did was they came in and straight away they covered the entire, they re-asphalted, and they just completely buried all the debris. So they covered it up literally as soon as they could with actual physical concrete. And this is showing the Pentagon is absolutely covered in cameras. They're not showing us anything. It was about I think it was about $10 million collectively for the entire investigation. To put that into perspective, the inquiry into whether was it Monica Lewinsky gave Bill Clinton a blowjob was $30 million. So they can spare $30 million for that, but for the biggest terrorist attack in America's history, they have to scrimp and save. It was understaffed, and then many of the staff that did had absolute massive conflicts of interest. And this is John Farmer Jr. saying, 6 out of the US government made a decision not to tell the truth about what happened. There, buddy. Yes, this is the 9/11 Commission, absolute farcical. George Bush and Dick Cheney were interviewed in secret, off the record, not under oath and behind closed doors. Their testimonies have not been made public. So we don't know exactly what they even said. So a real in an inquiry. And the 9/11 Commission, of course, completely disregarded the World Trade Center 7. Just, no, not even dealing with it. Okay, so Osama bin Laden. This is the patsy I was talking about. So as soon as the towers were happening, on the same day, the mainstream media was going, Osama bin Laden, Al-Qaeda, we are under attack, Al-Qaeda, Osama bin Laden, Al-Qaeda, Osama bin Laden. They repeat it, they repeat it, they repeat it. Has anyone ever stopped and asked, okay, well, what's the evidence linking Osama bin Laden to 9/11?
Well, I mean, the big question I asked, like, this guy was once funded by the Reagan administration and done work with the CIA, and even more strange, that family has a close connection to the Bush family. So this guy would make the perfect puppet.
Mate, I'm getting to that soon. You're right on the money, mate, for sure. You're right on the money. Yeah, so there is no direct evidence linking Osama bin Laden to the 9/11, but that didn't stop the mainstream media. That didn't stop the establishment. That didn't stop the government from saying, okay, we're under attack by Osama bin Laden. The evidence they do have was found in Afghanistan later. It was supposedly a recording of him bragging about causing 9/11. But it's in Arabic. And let's see what the translators have to say about this recording. I've carefully examined the Pentagon's translation. This translation is very problematic. At the most important places where it is held to prove the guilt of bin Laden, it is not identical with the Arabic. The American translators who listened to the tapes and transcribed them apparently wrote a lot of things in that they wanted to hear, but they cannot be heard on the tape no matter how many times you listen to it. So even the evidence that they're saying links Osama bin Laden to 9/11 isn't actually real evidence. But that's another story. So Osama bin Laden. Let's look at the history of Osama bin Laden. Osama bin Laden came from a wealthy Saudi Arabian family involved in the construction business. During the Russian invasion of Afghanistan, Osama was a leader of some of the CIA and Saudi-backed Mujahideen fighters. And I'll talk more about the Mujahideen when I talk about the war in Afghanistan. Yeah, so he was a jihadist. I'm not sure if he was Wahhabist, but no, we can talk about that later. So the connections between the Bush family and the bin Laden family. This is a group called the Carlyle Group. The Carlyle Group is an investment banking fund that invests in a lot of defense companies, a lot of government contracting companies. And would it surprise you that on September 10th and 11th in Washington, George Herbert Walker Bush, and Osama bin Laden's brother, Salim bin Laden, were actually having a meeting in Washington at the Carlyle Group. The connections are directly between the two families, for sure. Salim bin Laden actually invested in Abasto Energy, a company run by George Bush during his early days. During 9/11, all the aircraft were grounded to stop further hijacking. The bin Laden's private charter jet was given a direct clearance to fly back to Saudi Arabia from the government. And agents were also told to back off from investigating bin Laden and other Saudi royals prior to 9/11. So there's obviously a deep connection between the bin Ladens and the pullers of the lever of power in the American state system. So Osama bin Laden, even though he was on the FBI's most wanted list in July 2000, he was able to receive dialysis treatment in Dubai, and he was visited by a CIA agent, even though he was on the FBI's most wanted list. And then it doesn't stop them from using him as a patsy later on in 2001. Okay, so in 2011, right? This is SEAL Team 6. SEAL Team 6. SEAL Team 6 conduct a nighttime raid on Osama bin Laden's compound. They use 2 helicopters, and one of the helicopter crashes in the compound. That's the tail of the helicopter. During this raid, the SEAL Team 6 kills Osama bin Laden, and they give us the evidence that they killed him. This is the only footage that has ever. This photo on the right is the only footage ever of Osama bin Laden's dead body given to us by the government. If you can compare the two, this is a photo of Osama bin Laden. This is just, I'm not sure who that is. You can tell it's very third-grade Photoshop in a sense. It doesn't seem like Pentagon work. But SEAL Team 6 claimed to have killed Osama bin Laden. They didn't worry about keeping the body though. Instead, they decided to dump it in the ocean to make sure that there was never a shrine dedicated to Osama bin Laden. But we can make sure, we can trust the government and ensure that they killed Osama bin Laden. And coincidentally, 6 months later, 17 members of SEAL Team 6 die in a helicopter crash in Afghanistan. But I'm sure that has nothing to do with Osama bin Laden, right? That's a mess. Okay, this is one more little inkling that just throws the official story out the window. One of the hijackers was identified by a magic passport. So at the same time, whilst the 9/11 Commission is claiming that the fire was so hot that it was melting steel to cause a collapse of the building, at the same time, a passport was able to fly out of the plane down off the rubbish, and then eventually be collected later by the FBI to say, hey, we found a passport of a hijacker. Yeah, so in their magical land, jet fuel melts steel beams, but not paper passports. Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, so that first part of the presentation, I was talking about how 9/11 was an inside job, why I think 9/11 was an inside job, the evidence to say it was an inside job, a false flag. So now is the important part, or what makes more sense. Why? Key bono, who benefits? What is the purpose of attacking your own people and blaming it on a Saudi Arabian puppet? So let's begin. The war on terrorism. 9/11 launched the war of terrorism into the 21st century. The war on terrorism is currently the greatest threat to individual liberty we are currently facing. Al-Qaeda became the new boogeyman, and it enabled the West to extend its militaries overseas to fight terrorists, to fight Al-Qaeda, to fight these enemies abroad. And remember earlier when I talked about the problem reaction solution, you need an enemy. Well, Al-Qaeda became the West's new enemy. And because we don't have the Cold War anymore, we need the war on terror. Well, in reality, when we look at who Al-Qaeda is, we can see its deep ties back to the Western industrial intelligence state. The truth is that there is no Islamic army or terrorist group called Al-Qaeda, and any informed intelligence officer knows this. But there is a propaganda campaign to make the public believe in the presence of an identified entity representing the devil, only in order to drive TV watchers to accept a unified international leadership for a war against terrorism. The country behind this propaganda is the US. This is the British Secretary Robin Cook. But whether or not Al-Qaeda is real doesn't matter, because it achieved the goal of the Bush administration. and that was to launch the war on terror. This is a launch the war on terror. This is Bush declaring the.
Every nation in every region now has a decision to make. Either you are with us or you are with the terrorists. From this day forward, any nation that continues to harbor or support terrorism will be regarded by the United States as a hostile regime.
And that last bit's important as well, because that gives the West the ability to say, you are Al-Qaeda. We are extending across the globe. I'll talk about that more in a sec. So another reason for 9/11 was the Patriot Act. The Patriot Act was this massive 376-page long bill which completely changed America's security system, deep state system. It was introduced to the House of Representatives on October 23rd, 2001, and it was signed by the 26th of 2001. This thing was rammed through Congress and the House of Reps in America. The majority of senators barely had any time to even take a glimpse of how much stuff was in there. This is Richard Clarke, his counterterrorism czar. After 9/11, the government dropped the Patriot Act. Within 20 days, it was passed. The Patriot Act is huge, and I remember someone asking a Justice Department official, how did they write such a large statute so quickly? And of course, the answer was it had been sitting in the drawers of the Justice Department for the last 20 years, waiting for the event where they would pull it out. So it wouldn't be possible for them to have experienced 9/11 and then pass the Patriot Act. They had already written the Patriot Act in advance, and they were just waiting for the excuse to pass it. And that's false flag agenda 101. You have your objectives, and you use the problem reaction solution to achieve your objectives. The Patriot Act was by far a massive agenda of the American deep state. So the Patriot Act, it basically it granted the Department of Homeland Security was created the Homeland Security Act. I think that came a little bit after this, but it basically created a swathe of brand new powers for the intelligence agencies. It created an information superhighway, an information sharing network, which basically linked all these agencies, even though they were still individual agencies, that linked them together into like a cohesive web. And at the same time, the Patriot Act was basically the death of the Constitution. When the president declared war, it was the continuality of government, and now the Constitution no longer applies because the president is using wartime powers. So the right to privacy, the freedom from unwarranted searches and seizures, digital surveillance, detainment without access to lawyers or charges, and an expanded presidential executive branch all came out of the Patriot Act. And especially if you were Arab during the time after 9/11, people were getting picked up off the streets and literally there's a word after. They're literally getting jailed just off the street on suspicion of literally hearsay without the original constitutional protections. But this was during the absolute reign of terror of the war on terror. Then you have things like Guantanamo Bay, absolute human rights abuses galore. Many of the people in here were innocent without charge, but yet they were still subjected to the torture programs. Waterboarding is the most famous torture program, but don't kid yourself if you think waterboarding is the limit. These torture programs go beyond human rights abuses. It's insane just how far Guantanamo Bay stretches. But of course, it's all covered up with classified secrecy, and under the Patriot Act, this is all legal. Okay, so another motive for 9/11. The Project for a New American Century is a document you guys should all check out. It was a neoconservative think tank published a paper calling for an aggressive foreign policy. It planned to maintain US hegemony across the Middle East by engaging in a strong military occupation in the Middle East. And the neoconservatives are basically a who's who of the Western military industrial complex and the real war hawks of American policy. Okay, this is a clip from a guy called General Wesley Clark, and he was a general at NATO. And when we're talking about the pushes for war, well, this interview shows that the plans for war were already made before 9/11. They were wanting the agendas. They wanted the justification for 9/11 for the invasions. So this is Wesley Clark.
About 10 days after 9/11, I went through the Pentagon and I saw Secretary Rumsfeld and Deputy Secretary Wolfowitz. I went downstairs just to say hello to some of the people on the Joint Staff who used to work for me. And one of the generals called me in. He said, "Sir, you got to come in. You got to come in and talk to me a second." I said, "Well, you're too busy." He said, "No." He says, "We've made the decision. We're going to war with Iraq." This was on or about the 20th of September. I said, "We're going to war with Iraq. Why?" He said, "I don't know." He said, "I guess they don't know what else to do." So I said, "Well, did they find some information connecting Saddam to Al-Qaeda?" He said, No. He says, "There's nothing new that way. They've just made the decision to go to war with Iraq." He said, "I guess it's like we don't know what to do about terrorists, but we've got a good military and we can take down governments." And he said, "I guess if the only tool you have is a hammer, every problem has to look like a nail." So I came back to see him a few weeks later, and by that time we were bombing in Afghanistan. I said, "Are we still going to war with Iraq?" And he said, "Oh, it's worse than that." He said, he reached over on his desk, he picked up a piece of paper, and he said, I just got this down from upstairs," meaning the Secretary of Defense's office today, and he said, "This is a memo that describes how we're going to take out 7 countries in 5 years, starting with Iraq and then Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and finishing off Iran."
So they already had the plans to invade these countries. They just needed the justifications and the ability to do so. And without 9/11, they wouldn't have had that. Okay, so now one of the primary benefits for the military-industrial complex of 9/11 was the ability to launch the war in Afghanistan. So the U.S. wanted Osama from the Taliban, right? Because allegedly Osama was hiding out in Afghanistan. The Taliban declined to extradite bin Laden unless given evidence of his involvement in 9/11. And the evidence actually linking Osama has yet to still been released. The U.S. dismissed this as a delaying tactic. On October 7, 2001, the U.S. launched Operation Enduring Freedom, which was the invasion of Afghanistan. But let's take a look at who are they fighting in Afghanistan, right? The Taliban and Al-Qaeda were originally developed by the US and others as a force against the Russians. So it was during the Cold War that they were started sponsoring Mujahideen, and we'll hear Hillary Clinton does a great explanation of it herself.
We also have a history of kind of moving in and out of Pakistan. I mean, let's remember here, the people we are fighting today, we funded 20 years ago. And we did it because we were locked in this struggle with the Soviet Union. They invaded Afghanistan, and we did not want to see them control Central Asia. And we went to work. And it was President Reagan, in partnership with the Congress, led by Democrats, who said, you know what, sounds like a pretty good idea. Let's deal with the ISI and the Pakistani military, and let's go recruit these mujahideen. And let's get some to come from Saudi Arabia and other places, importing their Wahhabi brand of Islam so that we can go beat the Soviet Union. And guess what? They retreated. They lost billions of dollars, and it led to the collapse of the Soviet Union. So there's a very strong argument, which is, wasn't a bad investment to end the Soviet Union, but let's be careful what we sow because we will harvest. So we then left Pakistan. We said, okay, fine, you deal with the stingers that we've left all over your country. You deal with the mines that are along the border. And by the way, we don't want to have anything to do with you. In fact, we're sanctioning you. So we stopped dealing with the Pakistani military and with ISI, and we now are making up for a lot of lost time.
This is another one where she
So if you think if we walked away from this, didn't give them money today, it would be worse for us from a security standpoint.
I do. We're building a relationship that just did not exist. I said in our last trip when you were with me that we had a huge trust deficit, in part because the United States had, to be fair, we had helped to create the problem we're now fighting.
How?
Because when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, we had this brilliant idea that we were going to come to Pakistan and create a force of mujahideen, equip them with Stinger missiles and everything else to go after the Soviets inside Afghanistan. And we were successful. The Soviets left Afghanistan, and then we said, great, goodbye, leaving these trained people who were fanatical in Afghanistan and Pakistan, leaving them well armed, creating a mess, frankly, that at the time we didn't really recognize. We were just so happy to see the Soviet Union fall, and we thought, okay, fine, we're okay now. Everything's going to be so much better. Now you look back, the people we're fighting today, we were supporting in the fight against the Soviets.
So we've created our own problem, basically. America has. Australia basically is so interlinked with America these days. Anyway, throughout the 80s, Osama bin Laden was armed by the CIA and funded by the Saudis to wage jihad against the Russian occupation of Afghanistan. Al-Qaeda, literally meaning the database, was originally the computer file of the thousands of mujahideen who were recruited and trained with the help from the CIA to defeat the Russians. Again, this is Robin Cook. I think he died like 2 weeks after he wrote this article. He published this article as well. It's absolutely nuts. Anyway, another benefit for the Western military-industrial complex deep state from the war in Afghanistan is the absolute explosion in the production of opium. For any of you who know about the CIA Contras, i.e. the George Bush, Oliver North type, they were setting up Air Force bases to ship in cocaine from Nicaragua and shipping it to the American inner cities through a guy called Rick Ross or whatever, Free Ray Ross. Basically, they're doing the exact same thing with opium, and they're smuggling it through the absolute through the banking system as well. But opium is absolutely huge business, and they're using the exact same methods they used in Vietnam. They're using it again in Afghanistan. And you can actually look here. During 2001, when the Taliban was actually most supreme in Afghanistan, opium production plummeted. Absolutely almost near non-existent compared to after the US intervention, boom, straight back up. And there's multiple testimonies of US soldiers saying, oh yeah, we're defending drug lords, we're defending poppy fields all day. Like, that's easy to hear. Go for it.
Is this, so the opium is going to America, and is that where it's going?
No, it's going all over the world.
It's going all over the world, right. So is this for legal opium or illegal or both?
No, this is, like I was saying, illicit opium. Deep state involved drug cartels through the military-industrial complex, through the deep state. It's like a lot of the crack during the crack, the Reagan eras, right? A lot of it was coming from the CIA itself, because they had these Nicaraguan Contras down in Nicaragua who were fighting against the government, who wanted weapons and money. So their one export they could give was cocaine. And so in exchange for the cocaine, the CIA was giving them guns and money, whatever. But they were shipping in cocaine into their own country. Exact same thing's happening with heroin. But this time it gets a lot bigger as well, because you've got the pharmaceutical sides. That's another side of the story we can go on for. But yeah, it's the deep state involvement with the illicit black market for sure. Yeah, so that's another, besides massive profits for the military-industrial complex as well, Afghanistan. The war in Iraq. So straight after October 30th, we had, October we had 2000, we had the war in Afghanistan. Next after, we had the war in Iraq. The first casualty of war, when war comes, is truth. And this is no more obvious than when we see the lie they used to bring us into the war in Iraq. Saddam Hussein did not have weapons of mass destruction. It was a lie. It was a fabrication designed to enable Western military involvement in Iraq. And regardless of the truth to the matter now, the invasion occurred, and Hassan was toppled from power. He was hung in a military court. Yeah, that's what we can say about him. This man, Andrew Wilkie, he was the only person in the Western intelligence industry to publicly whistleblow. This guy was he was pretty high up in the Office of National Assessments, which is the ONA in Australia. Basically, what they do is they assess the military intelligence that is getting put forward, and they determine whether or not it's valid or not, basically. Andrew Wilkie came forward and said, the war in Iraq, there is no WMDs, and this was before the invasion, but it didn't matter because the direction was already decided. The Anglo-American establishment wanted a war in Iraq, and the invasion occurred regardless of the truth of whether or not Osama bin Laden actually did have weapons of mass destruction. The Chilcot report was released recently, which condemned the actions of Bush and Blair on unfounded evidence, but it's too little too late. The seeds of destruction have already occurred, and these war criminals are still walking around. It's a drop in the pond for what's actually happening. The military-industrial complex benefited massively off Iraq as well. Contracts out just everywhere. Dick Cheney, he was vice president under George Bush during the Bush administration. He was actually I think he was chief executive officer for Halliburton. And Halliburton made an absolute fortune on all sorts of contracts throughout Iraq, from reconstructing roads to prisons to military to all sorts. And then you had private mercenary companies such as Blackwater as well, making absolute fortunes of military contracts and the privatization of the militaries. So now we get to the modern day war on terror. This is where we're currently standing. ISIS has become the biggest threat to human, in the perceptions of our leaders and intelligence agencies. ISIS is the biggest threat to human existence in our time. Well, I actually think the war on terrorism is more of a danger, because the war on terrorism actually creates ISIS. And if we want to stop ISIS, we have to solve the war on terrorism. I could go into the history of ISIS. I'll just do a little bit. Western foreign policy was to understand ISIS, you have to understand Syria. So Western foreign policy was we wanted to get rid of Assad in Syria. So what the West did was they funded and trained and supported Syrian opposition rebels, the Free Syrian Army and others, things like that. What happened was after the Libyan revolution, they had all these leftover guns and weapons, and then I think Seymour Hersh did a great expose where he uncovered the rat line. So all these weapons that were being used in the Libyan revolution were shipped into, I think it was through Turkey, back into Syria to be used by the FSA, who has ties to al-Nusra, who has ties to ISIS, so to Al-Qaeda. So it literally became that the West was shipping weapons to its own enemy. But this is the farcical of the war on terror. One more thing about the war on terror, it's or about ISIS. We've had things like this. The Toyota Jeeps. A lot of the funding, training, support is actually coming from Western allies. Places like Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Turkey. their intelligence agencies are actively involved in, were actively involved in promoting these rebel groups. And so why ISIS? Why would the deep state manufacture ISIS? Well, they needed a new enemy for the global war on terror. Al-Qaeda wasn't as in your face anymore. They needed something bizarre. They needed to strengthen. They needed to increase the rhetoric to start increasing the authoritarian measures. ISIS enables the neocon faction of the military-industrial complex to continue to stay in the Middle East and continue generating profits in a never-ending war. See, the goal of war is never to win the war, it's to keep the war going. Because if you win the war, you stop the profits, you stop the money, you stop the contracts. So even if it means giving guns and ammunition to your enemy, it makes sense from the military-industrial complex perspective to do that. And that's often what was happening. You had reports of Iraqi police and army forces shooting down American and British helicopters, which were shipping in helicopter dropping ammunition to ISIS. So our own freaking intelligence agencies are supporting our enemies. It just makes no sense. Well, it makes sense when you understand the global objectives and the long-term objectives of what the war on terrorism is really about. And the biggest thing about ISIS is that it justifies the domestic police state. And that's what I'll be talking about next, which is the idea of the growing authoritarianism around the world. This is John McCain. He's basically the cheerleader for the military-industrial complex in America. This is him with the Free Syrian Army commanders. This is Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. I think that's what he said. Yeah, I think he ended up becoming like the head of ISIS. And then this guy over here is a massive press guy for ISIS. Like he does a lot of propaganda for ISIS, I think. Yeah. Okay, so the global war on terror has escalated. ISIS is attacking London through bombing, Madrid, France, Germany, all across Europe and the world. ISIS is taking credit for attacks which are just traumatizing the Western world. I want to go back to my point earlier when I said about false flag terrorism. The idea that you use a tragic event to push an agenda. And that is what we're seeing the deep state and the intelligence agencies around the world, all around the world, are using. They're using these increasing terrorist activities to attacks to increase their own authoritarian powers. And so just like the